In the winter of 1943, a locomotive sat idling in the Canadian Pacific Railway yards outside Montreal, its boiler groaning against the February cold. Nothing about it suggested importance. No streamlined casing, no polished brass, just a squat, functional machine built to one purpose: move tonnage. Within 3 years, locomotives exactly like this one would haul more war material across Canada than all the merchant ships leaving Halifax combined. And then, almost overnight, they would vanish from memory. This is the story of the Canadian Government Railways S1 class locomotive, the machine that kept the Atlantic lifeline open when Britain was starving and the Eastern Front was bleeding. Not a fighter plane, not a battleship. A freight locomotive that almost nobody remembers. The problem began in the summer of 1940. France had fallen, Britain stood alone. And Canada suddenly became the arsenal. Aluminum from Arvida, steel from Hamilton, wheat from the prairies, timber from British Columbia. All of it had to move east across a rail network already groaning under civilian demand to reach the convoys assembling in Halifax and Sydney. The Canadian Pacific and Canadian National Railways were operating at 140% capacity by October. Track maintenance was deferred, crews worked triple shifts, and locomotives, especially freight locomotives, were being run into the ground. Railway executives met in Ottawa that November behind closed doors at the Chateau Laurier. The numbers they presented to the Department of Munitions and Supply were blunt. At current tonnage demands, the existing locomotive fleet would be mechanically exhausted by mid-1942. Boilers were developing stress fractures, driving wheels were wearing through their tires faster than shops could refit them, and there was no time to build replacements using peacetime engineering standards. What Canada needed was a locomotive designed like a rifle, simple, rugged, repairable in the field. The man tasked with designing it was Henry Blaine, Chief Mechanical Engineer for Canadian National. Blaine had spent 30 years in railway workshops, starting as a boilermaker's apprentice in Stratford, Ontario. He understood that wartime meant compromise. Elegance was a luxury. Efficiency meant nothing if the machine couldn't be kept running by exhausted crews with dwindling parts inventories. His design brief was ruthless in its pragmatism. The locomotive would use a 2-10-2 wheel arrangement, 2 leading wheels for stability, 10 massive driving wheels for tractive effort, 2 trailing wheels to support the firebox. It would generate 85,000 pounds of tractive force, enough to haul 3,500 tons of freight across the Canadian Shield's undulating grades without assistance. But here was the critical decision: it would use standardized, interchangeable components. Every valve, every bearing, every brake shoe would be identical across the entire production run. If a locomotive broke down in Kapuskasing, the repair parts would be sitting in the store's car of the next passing freight. The boiler was designed with welded construction instead of riveted seams, faster to manufacture, easier to inspect for cracks. The firebox used nickel-steel alloys that could withstand thermal stress from low-grade coal. The running gear was overbuilt, with driving axles 25% thicker than standard practice demanded. It wasn't beautiful. It was a toolbox on wheels. Production orders went to Montreal Locomotive Works in January 1941. The first S1 rolled out of the erecting shop that April, 6 months from drawing board to service trials. By December, 40 were in operation. By the end of 1942, 200. They were assigned to the worst jobs on the system. The run from Winnipeg to Fort William carried grain to the Lakehead terminals, long drags across the Rock and Muskeg of northwestern Ontario, through winter temperatures that dropped to 40 below. The locomotives ran with their steam heating lines disconnected to maximize boiler pressure. Crews wrapped themselves in fur coats and canvas windbreaks. Ice formed on the inside of the cab windows. Engineman Donald Mackay, who worked S1 number 6004 through the winter of 1943, described the experience in a letter to his wife. "The cold comes through the floor plate like you're standing on a frozen lake. Your feet go numb. Your hands stick to the metal throttle. But the engine pulls. God, does it pull. We brought 110 loaded grain cars over Heron Bay in a single train. Never seen anything like it." The locomotives weren't glamorous, but they were relentless. On the eastern runs, Montreal to Halifax, the S1s hauled ammunition, aircraft components, and crated military vehicles. These trains ran under strict schedules dictated by convoy departure times. A delay of 6 hours could mean cargo missing its ship, which meant troops waiting in Britain without the equipment they needed. Railway operations centres tracked every S1 in real time using telegraph updates from dispatchers along the line. If a locomotive developed a hot bearing or a leaking steam line, a replacement was already being steamed up at the nearest roundhouse. The goal was to keep tonnage moving, not to preserve any individual machine. This approach was brutal on the locomotives themselves. Maintenance logs from the Canadian National Shops in Moncton show that by mid-1943, the average S1 was receiving a complete running gear overhaul every 18 months. Driving wheel tyres were being replaced every 60,000 miles, half the expected lifespan. Boiler tubes were developing stress cracks that required entire sections to be cut out and re-welded. But the locomotives kept running because they were designed to be repaired quickly. A standard boiler tube replacement on a pre-war locomotive required draining the boiler, removing the smokebox door, extracting the failed tubes, and rolling in new ones, a process that took skilled boilermakers 3 days. On an S1, the firebox was accessible from multiple entry points, and the tubes were held in place with expansion rings that could be removed and reinstalled in under 6 hours. Shop crews in Winnipeg developed a rhythm, locomotives in at midnight, repairs completed by dawn, back in service by the afternoon yard job. The human cost, of course, was invisible in the efficiency reports. Railway workers were classified as essential labour, which meant no strikes, mandatory overtime, and deferment from military service that carried its own social stigma. Men worked 72-hour weeks in shops that were freezing in winter and suffocating in summer. The air inside erecting halls was thick with coal smoke, metal dust, and the acrid smell of welding flux. Thomas Brennan, a machinist at the Montreal Locomotive Works, later recalled the atmosphere. "We built them fast because we had to. You'd see a boiler come in on Monday, and by Friday it was mated to a frame and rolling out the door. We knew what those engines were for. We knew boys from the neighbourhood who were overseas. You didn't complain, you just kept the wrenches turning." By 1944, the S1 fleet had become the invisible backbone of Canada's war effort. They hauled the aluminum that became Spitfire airframes. They moved the grain that fed Britain through the U-boat blockade. They carried the steel that built Liberty ships in maritime shipyards. And they did it in conditions that would have crippled more sophisticated machines. But their very utility contained the seeds of their obsolescence. The locomotives were designed for one thing, moving heavy tonnage in wartime. They burned coal at prodigious rates, 6 tons per 100 miles, because fuel economy didn't matter when the government was paying the bills. Their ride quality was punishing, with rigid frames that transmitted every track irregularity straight into the crew's spine. They were loud, uncomfortable, and required constant mechanical attention. In peacetime, these characteristics became liabilities. When the war ended in 1945, Canada's railways faced a different kind of crisis. Passenger traffic was booming as veterans returned home. Freight traffic was shifting toward manufactured goods that required faster, lighter trains. And diesel-electric locomotives, cleaner, more fuel-efficient, and easier to maintain, were becoming economically viable. The S1s, meanwhile, were worn out. 4 years of intensive service had left the fleet mechanically exhausted. Boilers were developing cracks faster than shops could repair them. Driving wheels were out of true, causing rough riding and increased track wear. And the locomotives' single-minded focus on tractive effort made them unsuitable for the higher-speed freight operations that post-war commerce demanded. Railway management made the calculation quickly. Rebuilding the S1 fleet would cost millions. The locomotives would still be coal burners in an era transitioning to diesel, and their heavy axle loadings restricted them to main lines with robust track structure, limiting their operational flexibility. By 1948, the scrapping had begun. S1 number 6001, the first production locomotive, was cut up at the Canadian National Shops in Stratford in June of that year. The boiler was salvaged for stationary use at a lumber mill in northern Ontario. The driving wheels were sold to a scrapyard in Hamilton. The rest went to the cutting torches. Over the next 5 years, the entire class was systematically dismantled. A few were sold to industrial operations, mining railways, logging companies, ports that needed heavy switches. But most simply vanished into scrap metal, their steel recycled into peacetime construction. By 1953, not a single S1 remained in mainline service. What's remarkable is how quickly they were forgotten. Railway enthusiast magazines of the 1950s barely mentioned them. Historical societies focused on preserving passenger locomotives, elegant machines with polished running boards and brass bells. The S1s, with their utilitarian design and unglamorous service, didn't fit the narrative of railway romance. No examples were preserved for museums, no plaques were erected. The locomotives that had hauled more war material than any other single type simply disappeared, leaving behind only fragmentary records in railway archives and fading memories in the minds of aging railwaymen. Why did this happen? Part of the answer is aesthetic. The S1s were never meant to be admired. They were tools, and like most tools, they were discarded when their job was done. In an era that increasingly valued the streamlined, the modern, the diesel-electric future, a coal-burning freight locomotive was an embarrassing reminder of an industrial past the country was eager to leave behind. But there's a deeper pattern here. The machinery of war is often remembered through its most dramatic expressions: fighter planes, battleships, tanks. These are machines that fit heroic narratives. They have aces and commanders. They participate in named battles. They can be photographed in moments of action that translate easily to museum dioramas and documentary footage. Freight locomotives don't offer that kind of drama. Their contribution is measured in tonnage and schedules, not victories and defeats. The crews who operated them were doing a job, not fighting a battle. And the work itself, the grinding, repetitive hauling of cargo across frozen landscapes, doesn't compress into easily digestible stories. Yet without that work, the war could not have been sustained. Consider the mathematics. Between 1941 and 1945, Canadian railways moved approximately 220 million tons of war material to eastern ports. The S1 fleet, at its peak, was responsible for moving roughly 40% of that tonnage, 88 million tons. That's more cargo than the entire American Lend-Lease shipment to the Soviet Union. Every aluminum ingot from Arvida, every crate of aircraft parts from Montreal, every trainload of grain from Saskatchewan. Somebody had to move it, and the S1s did the bulk of that moving. The human stories are equally invisible. The engineers who nursed overheating bearings through winter nights. The firemen who shoveled 6 tons of coal per shift while wearing heavy coats in sub-zero temperatures. The shop crews who rebuilt locomotives on impossible schedules. The dispatchers who coordinated thousands of trains across a continent with nothing but telegraph and handwritten orders. These people kept the supply chain functioning when Britain's survival depended on it. But their names don't appear in military histories, their work doesn't translate into compelling museum exhibits, and the machines they operated were scrapped before anyone thought to preserve them. What we're left with are fragments, a few photographs in Railway Historical Society archives, S1s in yards covered in soot, surrounded by workers in oil-stained coveralls. maintenance logs showing repair schedules that seem impossible until you remember the stakes. Letters from enginemen to their families describing shifts that lasted until exhaustion made every decision feel like sleepwalking. And one small detail that surfaces in Canadian national records from 1944, a notation that S1 locomotives were accumulating mileage at rates 30% higher than any other class in the fleet. They were literally being run into the ground. The irony is that the locomotives did exactly what they were designed to do. They moved the tonnage, they kept the convoys supplied, they operated in conditions that would have sidelined more sophisticated machines. And then, when the emergency ended, they were discarded because their utility was too specific, their design too compromised for peacetime service. There's a lesson here about how we remember technology. We preserve the beautiful, the innovative, the machines that represent leaps forward. We build museums around Spitfires and Sherman tanks and Liberty ships. But the unglamorous workhorses, the machines that simply did the job day after day without drama or innovation, those we forget. The S1s weren't revolutionary. They didn't pioneer new technology or push the boundaries of engineering. They were a pragmatic solution to an immediate problem built with existing technology and straightforward design principles. But pragmatism, it turns out, is easy to overlook. In the end, perhaps that's fitting. The locomotives were designed to be invisible, to fade into the background while the tonnage kept moving. They succeeded so completely that even their existence has faded from memory. What remains is a question. How many other essential machines have vanished this way? How many critical contributions to history have been scrapped and forgotten because they weren't glamorous enough to preserve? The S1s saved Canada's supply lines. They kept Britain fed and armed. They hauled the material that helped win a war. And then they disappeared, leaving barely a trace. What other stories are fading before we notice they're gone?